We have already talked about Jesus' life being the climax of the story of Israel. And last week we began looking at the second dimension, or to continue our analogy, the second speaker that needs to be adjusted. And that second speaker is the life of Jesus as the story of Israel's God coming back to his people once again. So the story of Jesus is the story of Israel's God coming back to his people once again. This is what we spent our entire time kind of introducing last week. If all we do is view the life of Jesus as Jesus is God, and that's it, and we detach it from Jesus being Israel's God coming back to his people, then there's going to be a distortion of things. And so what we need to do is we need to get a little bit of distance from our tradition in order to see this as the Jewish people would have seen it when they read the Gospels. It has been popular for well over a century now to view the Gospel of John as the book that's all about Jesus being God, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke at the Synoptic Gospels as the Gospels that are all about Jesus' humanity. So the Gospel of John, that's the book that's really about Jesus being God. And then the other three are much more focusing on Jesus' humanity. Or another way of saying it is that John has a high Christology and the Synoptics have a lower Christology. And I'm here to say that that is absolutely and simply wrong. We do not have in the Gospels one book that focuses on his divinity and other three books that just focus on his humanity. That is absolutely wrong on both sides. There are times where John focuses on the humanity, and as we're going to see tonight, the Synoptic Gospels have a very high Christology. So let's just start in the book of Mark. So turn with me to the book of Mark. We believe that the book of Mark was the first gospel that was written. So I want to start there. Now, as we come to Mark, you do not need the kind of explicit statement that you find in John about Jesus being Israel's God. In other words, and there's an explicit statement where Jesus says in John, I and the Father are one. That's a pretty explicit statement. You don't need that kind of explicit statement in order to see that Mark is focusing on Jesus being Israel's God, or Mark focusing or having a high Christology. What we need to do, and what Mark gives us in chapter 1, are these prophecies of the coming God being directly applied to the coming Jesus. That's what we need. The Old Testament is saying God is coming back again for his people. All right? The Old Testament leaves off with Israel's God, everyone waiting for Israel's God to come back to his people once again. What Mark is going to do in this very first chapter, in these first 11 verses, he is going to link that expectation of Israel's God coming to the coming of Jesus. So let's read the first 11 verses, and then I'll point out a few things for us. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. As it is written in Isaiah the prophet, Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. John appeared baptizing in the wilderness and proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sin. And all the country of Judea and all Jerusalem were going out to him and were being baptized by him in the river Jordan, confessing their sins. Now John was clothed with camel's hair and wore a leather belt around his waist and ate locusts and wild honey. And he preached, saying, After me comes one who is mightier than I, the strap of whose sandals I am not worthy to stoop down and untie. I have baptized you with water, but he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And when he came up out of the water, immediately he saw the heavens being torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." Mark quotes Malachi 3:1 at the very beginning of this chapter. Malachi 3 is a passage all about Israel's God returning to them at last. What Mark has just done for us by quoting Malachi 3:1 at the very beginning is he is saying, you are waiting for your God to come back to you, and he is taking those expectations and directly applying them to Jesus. He couples that in verses 2 and 3, he couples that with Isaiah chapter 40, verses 3 through 11, okay, which is a passage about the prophet shouting to Zion that God is coming back at last and coming back in glory. So what Mark is doing right off the bat is Mark is saying, here is this passage in Isaiah where it says God is coming to Zion and he's coming in glory. Here's this passage in Malachi that says that God is coming back for his people at last. And what he does is he applies it directly to Jesus. This can only mean for Mark that Mark sees God himself arriving at last to renew and restore his people. And of course he does that right here on the very first page of his gospel. This is every bit of a high Christology as John has. It's just high Jewish Christology, which we're not very good at. Okay? That's the issue why we can read through these first 11 verses and not see that John is saying God, Israel's God, has returned for his people, and he has done it in the flesh of Jesus Christ. It's high Christology. It's not just, but it's a high Jewish Christology rather than a non-Jewish Christology that we usually think about. This is the context for which everything in the rest of the book needs to be viewed through. John, at the very beginning of the book, says, let me quote a couple passages that we all know, letting us know that Israel's God has come. And he has come in the person of Jesus Christ. So then when we move forward, like verses 16 through 20, when Jesus calls his first disciples, or in chapter 3, verses 13 through 19, when he sets apart the 12, he is acting in a symbolic way, echoing what God did in the Old Testament by establishing the nation of Israel. Have you ever wondered why Jesus chose 12 disciples? Because what he's doing is he is retelling the story of Israel's God coming for his people. Jesus comes, he chooses 12 disciples, and he brings them in. And here's what's interesting. When Jesus calls these 12 disciples, he is not viewing himself as the first among equal or even the leading member of the 12. Jesus does not see himself as one of the 12, right? He actually calls the 12 into existence, doesn't he? He doesn't have 12 disciples until he calls them and brings them into existence and gives them their status as his 12 disciples. He gives them their role of what they're supposed to be doing. By the way, in the Old Testament, who was the one that did that? Yahweh did. Yahweh was the one who called the 12 tribes into a nation. And here Jesus now, echoing the very same thing Yahweh did in the Old Testament, he's calling 12 disciples as Yahweh bringing this into existence, giving them their status and giving them this role. This was Israel's dream coming true. Mark has Jesus going about and doing things and saying things that declare that Israel's God has now become their king. Israel's dream has come true in the person of Jesus Christ. Mark has Jesus doing this over and over and over again. It explains some of the other actions of Jesus as well, like commanding the wind and the waves to be calm in chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. I mean, can you imagine being there on that boat in the midst of that storm and Jesus stepping to the edge of the boat and speaking to the wind and speaking to the water, and it immediately obeys him? Listen, that was not just to say, I'm God. Now, does it say he's God? You better believe it. But in a Jewish context, I mean, we've got all of these passages. I just wrote down a few of them in the Old Testament. Psalm 65:7, Psalm 89:9, Psalm 107:28 and 29. Do you know what all three of those verses talk about? Yahweh being the ones that commands the wind and the waves. You see, in a Jewish context, Israel's God does that. And now stands this one on the edge of the boat doing the very thing that God is said to do in the Old Testament. This and similar passages, understood properly, are enough to make people ask this question. Suppose this isn't a story of a man proving he's God, but about God coming back in person to rescue his people. Now again, am I denying that Jesus is God? Of course not. What I'm saying is, we want to go one more step, because it's actually bigger than that. It's not just that Jesus is God. It is that Jesus is the Creator God, Yahweh from the Old Testament, who has come back once again for his people. He's just come in a way that they were not expecting. But his entire Mark from the very beginning sets us off and says, this one Jesus who's come to be baptized, this is the one, this is our Yahweh God who has come back to rescue us. Our King has come. Our Messiah has come. Turn to the book of Matthew. Matthew and Luke do something very similar. And Bible scholars, if they're right, and I tend to think they are, Matthew and Luke use Mark as one of their sources as they're writing their Gospels. Now, it's not obviously not the only source, but they are using Mark as a source. So it would be natural for us to see them pick up this same idea and continue on with it. Now, Matthew makes things clear in the frame that he creates. Okay, I'm going to show you this frame. He creates the first part of the frame at the very beginning of the book, the second part of the frame at the end of the book. And this frame that he creates for his story lets us know right off the bat, this is Israel, God coming for his people. In the first chapter, Mary's child is to be named Yeshua, Jesus, because he is the one who will save his people from their sin. The name here, Yeshua, is being interpreted as Yahweh saves or Yahweh delivers. Look at Matthew's comment in verse 22 and 23 of chapter 1. Verse 22. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name, what? Emmanuel, meaning God with us. Listen to me, church. Yes, it is God who has come to humanity. But it is Israel's God who has come for Israel. Now, that's not the end of the story. He didn't just come for Israel and he's done. Right? We went through Paul, how the Gentiles are grafted in and the Gentiles are brought in. But Israel was waiting for their God to come. And here, this one being born is named Yeshua. Yahweh saves. He is Emmanuel, God with us. He is Yahweh who has come to rescue us. In other words, we are to look at Jesus and see him as the personal presence of Israel's God, coming to be with his people, coming to rescue them from the plight that they have brought upon themselves because of their sin. So that's the first framework, right? Emmanuel, God with us. Now turn to chapter 28. You know the Great Commission, right? Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 through 20. And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And listen to how the book ends. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. How does the book start? Israel's God has come. How does the book end? He is with us forever. Jesus ends the book by saying, I am Yeshua, Yahweh delivers. I am Emmanuel, and I am with you always. Israel's God had come, never to leave his people again. His people is just more than one. That's next week. This frame enables us to understand some things and some scenes in the book of Luke that maybe we haven't quite understood the same way, in the way that his disciples worship him. Look at chapter 14 of Matthew. Verses 32 and 33. So Jesus says, walked on water. And after Jesus gets in the boat, they say this. When they got into the boat and the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. Again, this title, Son of God, has a very, very Jewish link to it. Psalm chapter 2, behold, you are my son, today I have begotten you. I have set my king upon my holy hill. The nations are going to rage. The nations are not going to like it. But my son is now ruling the world. And the disciples, by declaring him the Son of God, are saying that very thing. You are the Psalm chapter 2 king. You are the one who has come to us. Jesus goes on to tell several stories about masters and servants to illustrate what he himself was doing, while being aware that in the ears of his hearers, stories about masters and servants and kings and subjects and so on would be recognized as stories about Israel's God and Israel itself. When a Jewish person hears a story about a master and a servant, those Jewish people are going to view the master as Yahweh and themselves as the servant. That's the way they're going to view it. So when we go to those stories, that's how we're now interpreting this. That Yahweh is the master, Yahweh is the king, and these servants or these slaves, that's Israel. Let me give you one of these from the book of Luke. Turn to the book of Luke. I want you to see this in chapter 19. verses 11 through 27. I'm going to read this one. Starting in verse 11, chapter 19. As they heard these things, he proceeded to tell a parable. Because he was near to Jerusalem, that's important, and because they supposed that the kingdom of God was to appear immediately, he said, therefore, a noble man went into a far country to receive for himself a kingdom and then returned. Calling 10 of his servants, he gave them 10 minas. And he said to them, engage in business until I come. But his citizens hated him and sent a delegation after him, saying, we do not want this man to reign over us. When he returned, having received the kingdom, he ordered these servants to whom he had given the money to be called to him, that he might know what they had gained by doing business. And the first came before him and said, Lord, your mina has made 10 minas more. And he said to them, well done, good servant, because you have been faithful in a very little. You shall have authority over 10 cities. And the second came, saying, Lord, your mina has made 5 minas. And he said to them, and you are to be over 5 cities. Then another came, saying, Lord, here is your mina, which I kept laid away in a handkerchief, for I was afraid of you, because you are a severe man. You take what you did not deposit, and reap what you did not sow. And he said to them, I will condemn you with your own words, you wicked servant. You knew that I was a severe man, taking what I did not deposit and reaping what I did not sow. Why then did you not put my money in the bank, and at my coming I might have collected it with interest? And he said to those who stood by, take the mina from him and give it to the one who has the 10 mina. And they said to him, Lord, he has 10 minas. I tell you that everyone who has, more will be given. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. But as for these enemies of mine, you did not want me to reign over them. Bring them here and slaughter them before me. Now, most people read that, and their context is, well, this is about the second coming. This is about the second coming. We are the servants. Human beings are the servants, and God is the king and the master. Is that how the Jewish people reading that would have read that? No, they would not have. What they would have read this as, we are the servant. God is the master. He has given us the law, the prophets, the Psalms. He has done all of this. He has given us all of this stuff. And what have we done with it? Nothing. And now the king has come back, and the servants have done nothing with it. Now, the reason I tie that to then and not the end of the world is because right after that's the triumphal entry. Right after that is Jesus coming into Jerusalem. Then he weeps over Jerusalem. Then he cleans the temple out. You see what's going on here, right? All of those things now is Jesus coming into Jerusalem as, here I am, the king, who has come back now into Jerusalem to find that you do not believe, you're not following Yahweh. I come to find that you've made the temple, which is supposed to be a house of prayer, a den of thieves. I gave you everything with my covenant. And what have you done with it? Nothing. Your God, the God of Israel, the Creator God, has now come back in the person of Jesus Christ. He enters into Jerusalem as Yahweh coming back to Jerusalem to find what? To find unbelief and unfaithfulness. John has a long discourse in chapter 21. Luke, has a long discourse in chapter 21 where he talks about the destruction of the temple. And he says this temple has to fall. This temple must be destroyed. The temple was God's house, was it not, in the Old Testament? It's where the manifest presence of God appeared. But if God was coming in person, and he finds that the temple is now a symbol of Israel's failure, it's got to go. Only one possible result could come. It must be destroyed. Luke is trying to tell us that what Jesus was doing is what God was doing. In chapter 8, verse 39, keep in mind that sentence I just made. For Luke, what Jesus is doing is what God was doing. Luke viewed Jesus as Yahweh who has come back to his people. After Jesus heals this man who has a demon in him, start in verse 38.
What chapter did you say?
Chapter 8. Luke 8, 38. The man from whom the demons had gone begged that he might be with him. But Jesus sent him away, saying, return to your home and declare how much God has done for you. So this guy wanted to follow Jesus around, and Jesus said, no. You go back to where you're from, and you declare what God has done for you. And look at what Luke writes in verse 39. And he went away proclaiming throughout the whole city how much Jesus had done for him. How is Luke viewing Jesus then? Jesus is God doing God's work. If Jesus has come, he is the one we've been waiting for. And when Jesus comes, any work that he does is God's work. In one way or another, all three synoptic gospels are clear in telling that the story of Jesus is the telling of the story of Israel's God coming back to his people. And listen to me, he comes to his people in judgment and in mercy. Both. He comes in judgment and in mercy. Now let's look at John. John chapter 1. Of course, right off the bat, in John 1, you know the famous passage where Jesus immediately John says he's God. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and he was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The word logos here is translated word. People have linked that to all kinds of stuff. They've linked it to, well, here's the view of the Greeks at the time of the word logos. This is the way. What I want to do is I want us to think about it in this context. How would the Jews have thought about this word? When it is said that Jesus is the Word, how would the Jews thought about this word? Well, Isaiah 55, 10 through 11, here's how they thought about the Word of God. When God's Word goes out, right? It's like rain or snow that falls. It accomplishes exactly the purpose that it was sent out to accomplish. That Isaiah 55, 10 through 11, is in the context of Isaiah 53 through 55. That's very important. Isaiah 53 through 55 is all about the coming Messiah. We know chapter 53, right? The suffering Messiah, the suffering servant. And then in chapter 54, we have talk of the new creation. We have in Isaiah 55, thorns and thistles now being replaced by the wonderful trees and shrubs. This is all newness growing, newness coming because of this suffering servant Messiah. And so I think when we read John chapter 1 and we see the Word of God, I think we need to immediately think, here's how the Israelites, here's how the Jews would have viewed this. The Word of God is being sent forth to accomplish God's purposes. So here God is, the very Word of God, coming and accomplishing what? Being the suffering Messiah, bringing the new creation, changing everything, but coming to his people once again. In other words, the Creator God is Israel's God, has now become human. In verse 14, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. I said already in this series, that word dwelt literally could be translated tabernacled among us. What God did in the Old Testament by coming and tabernacling with his people in the Old Testament, he is now doing in the person of Jesus Christ in the New. Jesus is the manifestation of Yahweh, the Creator God, in the flesh, coming for Israel. Now, with this framework, we should be able to read right through John, discerning now what Jesus is actually doing. For instance, he goes to Jerusalem over and over and over again. Many times he goes while they're having festivals. And in each case, he goes and one-ups the festival itself by basically saying, oh yeah, see this festival stuff that's going on? Yeah, that's all about me. That's all about me. Now, only Yahweh could say that. Only Yahweh would dare come to the festivals that he established in the Old Testament, see Israel participating in the festivals, walks in and goes, oh yeah, this is all about me. And let me tell you the spiritual significance of it. Let me demonstrate one of them for you. Turn to John chapter 7. Here Jesus shows up at the Feast of Tabernacles, and look what happens. I was going to read verse 37 and 38 for the sake of time. John chapter 7, 37 and 38. On the last day of the feast, the great day, Jesus stood up and cried out, if anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Now, let's just stop right there for a second. He shows up at the final day of the Feast of Tabernacles. I mean, this is the great day, the big day of this feast. And he walks into the crowd and says, if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. It's like, wait a minute, this ain't supposed to be about you right now. We're worshiping Yahweh. Yet Jesus is making it about him. John is saying, well, it's because Jesus is Yahweh. He's Israel's God who's come back for his people. And now he's yelling to his people, if you're thirsty, come to me. Your God has come back to you right here in the flesh. If you're thirsty, come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. Now this he said about the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were to receive. As for yet the Spirit had not been given, because Jesus was not yet glorified. Each day at the Feast of Tabernacles, water in gold vessels were ceremonially carried in a procession from the pool of Siloam to the temple. This water was then poured out in front of the altar of burnt offerings. Isaiah 13:3 was recited. So they would take water in golden vessels out of the pool of Siloam. They would in procession march to the temple, and they would pour out this vessel of water in front of the burnt offering, and they would recite Isaiah 13:3. With joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation. That's what they would quote as they poured the water out. And John records Jesus coming to this event. He comes to this event. This is Yahweh in the person. Their God, Israel's God, has come back to them in the person. And now what he's saying, everything you're doing right here is fulfilled in me. You're symbolically carrying this water and pouring it in the temple, and you're citing Isaiah chapter 13:3 that with joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation. Well, here I am. Anyone who is thirsty for this kind of salvation, come to me. And of course, we know the vast majority of Israel did not do so. Everything that is happening in the temple happens and is fulfilled in him. Everything. The way the temple's built, everything they did in the temple, all of it was about Yahweh's God. And Jesus was Yahweh's God. And he's saying all of this that you're doing is fulfilled in me. I am your God. Of course, this all leads up to the prayer of Jesus in John chapter 17. Which, by the way, if the temple and everything going on in the temple is ultimately about Jesus, then who's the high priest about? It's about Jesus, right? Do you know what we call the prayer in John chapter 17? We call it the high priestly prayer. Jesus is doing the very thing that the high priest would do. He's interceding on behalf of his people. It's rightly called the high priestly prayer. So again, John is establishing that Jesus is not just God. Yes, he is God. But for us to understand the life of Jesus better, we need not just to understand that he's God, right? We just want to prove to atheists that Jesus is God. So that's all. We're just going to prove to atheists that Jesus is God. It's much larger than that. If we're going to understand the story, what it is it's Israel's God, the Creator God, coming back to his people, fulfilling everything that he promised to fulfill, kept coming and doing what he said he was going to do, bringing judgment and mercy upon his people, fulfilling everything. John chapter 17, before his death, acting as the role of high priest. So, we need to adjust this speaker here. The second speaker needs to be adjusted. In the West, we've had it cranked up so high, right? We have had it cranked up so high, Jesus is God, that we have distorted whose God he was, what God are we talking about, what's the purpose of him coming this last time for the nation of Israel. All of that is really important. So, here's what we need to do. We need to crank up the first one. This is the story of Israel. The life of Jesus is the climax of the story of Israel. And we need to turn down the second one so that it's not just Jesus is God and then distorting everything and blowing everything out. We need to turn it down so we understand he's Israel's God, coming back to Israel once again. We understand those first two. It is going to make things in the Gospels, as we read them, some things are really going to make sense that may not have made sense anymore or before. Or it's going to give new meaning to things. It's going to beef up some stories that we have read before. And we're going to go, okay, now I see what's going on here. Israel was waiting for Yahweh to come back and fulfill promises. And here's Jesus saying this. Well, he's saying that he's here doing it. And they miss it for the most part. He is God. He is Israel's God, the God of Israel coming back for his people.